Hey everyone, how's it going? So today I want to do something a little bit different. Today I want to do a video talking about what I think are three really solid bookish double features. Okay, so when we talk about double features, normally we're talking about movies, talking about two movies in a row. And normally when you think of a double feature of films, you think of two films that somehow are connected thematically or in terms of their setting, or maybe they share an actor, or maybe they share a director or something like that. They usually link up somehow, however feebly. So that's what we normally talk about when we talk about double features. But we hear about double features much less frequently in terms of books that might be really interesting to read one right after the other, or maybe even at the same time if you're someone who reads multiple books. And I think there's good reason for why double features are a much bigger part of kind of the cinephile world than the bibliophile world. I think it's a lot easier to watch two films in a row than it is to read two books in a row or read two books at the same time, because most films you can watch in 2 hours or so. And so a double feature should not go longer than like 4 hours. On average, of course. There are going to be outliers. Movies are shorter or longer, but on the whole, you usually can get through a double feature in one evening. Whereas a bookish double feature, unless you're Steve Donahue, is going to take a few weeks, depending on the length of the book, because it just takes a longer time and it's a more taxing process to read a book than it is to watch a movie, because watching a movie is fundamentally kind of a more passive thing than reading, because when you're reading, you have to be there looking at the pages or listening and processing the words. Whereas when you watch a movie, the movie's going to play whether you're paying attention or not. So it's a fundamentally more passive kind of thing. And that's not to knock film watching at all. I love films. And of course, many people, myself included, I like to think, do watch films very actively and pay attention to many of the details. But fundamentally, film watching is a more passive absorption of a work of art than is reading. And so bookish double features don't get as much attention as film double features. But today, in this video, I want to talk about three bookish double features that I think would be really solid. This is not to say that I have actually read these books as a double feature, but I think they would make each of them great double features. And I'm going to talk about each book just a little bit, because I don't want this video to be horribly long, so I can't talk about each book in a lot of depth. But I'm going to introduce each book a little bit and then talk about why I think each double feature, within each double feature, why the two films, I think, or the two books, would chime well with one another. And so I'm going to begin with a pair of books that I've always kind of thought of them as an interesting pair, and not just because they were published in the same year. So my first double feature is Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, published in 1985, and Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, also published in 1985. Now, what's interesting here to start with is that these two novels were, as I just pointed out, were both published in 1985, but no one really ever talks about that. And I think it's so interesting that these two books, these two novels that are both Westerns, and that are both, at this point, basically canonized. I mean, it's hard to say with books published as recently as 1985 that they are a part of like the canon. But they're both taught in schools, they're both still widely read, they're widely acclaimed, they both have academic articles written about them, and so on and so forth. So they are basically both canonized, and yet people don't really seem to connect them very often, right? Even though they are, for one thing, both Westerns. But the connections, I think, go a slightly deeper than that. And slightly deeper, of course, than the fact that they're both published in 1985. So for those who aren't familiar with Lonesome Dove and Blood Meridian, although I have a hard time imagining most people watching this aren't already familiar with at least Lonesome Dove, and probably a lot of you know Blood Meridian, but Lonesome Dove is about two former Texas Rangers in the late 19th century named Gus McCrae and Woodrow Call, who hail from Lonesome Dove, Texas, And they decide at the beginning of this novel to round up a bunch of cattle, which they actually steal from Mexico, and drive them up to Montana and start their own ranch. And so the novel is their journey going from Lonesome Dove, Texas, all the way to Montana, braving treacherous weather, lack of food, occasionally hostile encounters with white people and Native American people and others, and delves deeply into the pasts and loves and losses of all the characters. All right, and there's a lot of characters in this beyond just Gus and Woodrow, but I focus on them just because they are the main two, and because again I don't want each introduction to each book to be too expansive. So that's Lonesome Dove, and then Blood Meridian is also a sort of a Western. It takes place in the Southwest, in California, and to a lesser extent in New Mexico, I believe. It's about a teenaged boy who is just referred to as the Kid, and at the beginning of the novel, he runs away from home and ends up falling in with the Glanton gang, who I believe were a historically real gang, or at least based on a historically real gang, who went around various parts of the Southwest, but especially California, and slaughtered Native American people and took their scalps and turned them in to get the bounties. Because in California, at least, there was a bounty on any scalps you could acquire from Native Americans, right? It was a part of this horrifying, huge genocide, right? And so the novel is very dark, very violent, full of carnage and basically watching a genocide happen in real time. And it delves into many other things about America, about the nature of evil, and all this other stuff. So these books, in many ways, are very, very different in style, in tone. Larry McMurtry writes in a much more toned down, reserved style. It's very beautiful, but it is much more toned down and reserved. Whereas Cormac McCarthy is known for having this sort of quasi-biblical adornment to his prose, right? But why I think these would make a good double feature is because beyond them being published in the same year and both being Westerns, they both are fundamentally kind of not only about America, but also about America's idea of America, specifically America's idea of the Old West. That comes out probably more obviously in Blood Meridian because it is so dark and violent and about how this quote-unquote settlement of the West was based on this horrifying genocide and often carried out by these horrifically nihilistic people who kind of are epitomized in the Judge Holden, who's a really prominent character in the Glanton gang. So this very much was written as kind of an anti-Western, a Western that comments on the genre of the Western. But what's often lost in conversations about Lonesome Dove is that Lonesome Dove was also written with that same kind of spirit. Larry McMurtry himself has talked about how when he went to write Lonesome Dove, he thought of it as his way of pushing back against this romanticized idea of the Old West. He talks about how he thought he wrote this novel about a bunch of really rough people living really rough lives, and that was his way of commenting on the sort of romanticized view of the Old West that a lot of people had. And yet, a lot of people look at Lonesome Dove now as that very romanticized vision of the Old West. And so Larry McMurtry was always a little bit disillusioned with the way that people viewed Lonesome Dove. And he also really didn't like the miniseries adaptation of Lonesome Dove because he thought it really leaned into the romanticization of the Old West. But Lonesome Dove was written to actually push back against the romanticization of the Old West, right? Because there is a lot in Lonesome Dove as well about the genocide of Native Americans and what Black African Americans faced as well. There's a black character in Lonesome Dove who there's a lot around him and his experience, and the lives of women out west as well, and how difficult they had it compared to men. And so Larry McMurtry did write it as a kind of comment on the romanticized view of the Old West, even though its reception has kind of, I think, lost that. So I think these would make a cool double feature. at some point. And actually, they're both books I'm due for rereading. I haven't read either of them in several years. And Blood Meridian in particular, I feel like I need to revisit, because when I first read it, I actually didn't love it, but it's really grown in my estimation as I've like thought about it and talked with people about it. So yeah, that's my first double feature. My second double feature, switching gears pretty significantly, my second double feature is The Color Purple by Alice Walker and Maurice by E.M. Forster. So, The Color Purple, I'll start with that. This was published in 1982. I didn't intentionally pick another book from the 80s, but this book was published in 1982. It takes place across a big chunk of the first half of the 20th century in Georgia. And it's about a young black girl named Celie, who is just put through some really awful things at the beginning of the story. And so I don't feel like I'm spoiling too much, because literally you find out in the first few pages about this. When I say that early in this book, she is raped by her own father and actually gives birth to children as a result of that. Those children are taken away from her, and then she is forced to marry this man who she doesn't really even like much. And the story kind of goes from there. It's also, to a degree, about her sister, Nettie, and the other characters, of course, appear as well. But it's Celie's kind of her trials and tribulations in the American South in the first half of the 20th century as a black woman and as a queer woman. She kind of the course of this novel starts to realize that she is attracted to women, and so she finds love for the first time, and she manages to really, well, anyway, that's a story. So that's an introduction to the story of The Color Purple. And then Maurice, on the surface, very, very different, of course. It takes place in Edwardian England, so England in the early 20th century, before the First World War. It's about a guy named Maurice, who realizes at a certain point when he's at college in Cambridge that he's gay. And it's about his relationship with another man, with Clive, and later a relationship with a different man. And so it's just, again, his trials and tribulations navigating this very repressive environment, because in Edwardian England, homosexuality was criminalized. You could just go to prison for being a homosexual. I mean, just look up the trial of Oscar Wilde, for example. And so it's just him navigating his relationship with Clive, and later his relationship with a different guy in, again, this deeply repressive environment for gay men and gay women, but also just in general, because Edwardian England was just very repressed in general, sexually, even outside of sexual orientation, very repressed ideologically, and so on and so forth. And so these two books, I didn't do this intentionally, but I like how this second double feature, the superficial similarities aren't quite as striking, right, as with Lonesome Dove and Blood Meridian. But both of these novels are about queer individuals navigating a deeply repressive time and place, right? Of course, Celie is in the American South in the first half of the 20th century, so Jim Crow was still very much in place. She was also queer in a time when being queer was not the norm. And then Maurice, of course, is in Edwardian England, where being gay is just not accepted, and you can literally go to prison for it, right? And also is repressive in many other ways. Okay, so we have these two queer characters navigating these deeply repressive environments. Both go through some awful things. Celie probably more than Maurice, I have to say. I mean, it's not a competition, but Celie does go through some truly horrific things over the course of this book. They both go through hell in these two novels, and yet they both have happy endings, or the closest thing to a happy ending that you could hope for as a queer woman in a queer black woman in the American South in the first half of the 20th century, or a queer man in Edwardian England. They both basically have happy endings, right? So these two characters push through and manage to it's implied, find happiness, which I think is I think is rather lovely. So that's my second Bookish double feature. All right, and then my last Bookish double feature. My last Bookish double feature has a bit more of those superficial similarities, but then also a lot of differences. So the two books here are Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, published in 2004, and The Blood of the Lamb by Peter de Vries, published in 1961. All right, so I'm gonna introduce them both, but I'll start with The Blood of the Lamb because I suspect this is the one that more people watching this will not have heard of. This is about a guy named Don Wanderhop, and I love that name, Don Wanderhop. I think it's kind of supposed to be a kind of a joke on his life story that's told in this novel. It's basically just a story of his life. He grows up in a Calvinist family in Chicago in the 1950s, and it's just about him kind of making his way through life. He gets married. He has kind of an impulsive marriage when he's very young. The marriage, as you might imagine, given how it begins, doesn't go very well. He has a daughter. But a big thread that runs throughout this as well is his struggle with his faith. So he's not a pastor or anything, but a big part of this book and kind of the climax of it is his grappling with his religious faith. And this novel, I regret to say that I haven't read it in so long that my memories of it are a bit hazier than I would probably like in talking about it in depth, but it is so beautiful. I remember just being so moved by it. It is such a beautiful work of literature. I wish it were more well-known because it seems to not be very well-known. The only reason that I knew about it was actually because John Green recommended it. John Green, back in the day, he still does them, but he did some book recommendation videos, and this was one of the books he recommended at one point, and I went and I read it, and it was great. So anyway, whatever you think of John Green, he's got good taste in books. So that's the first book. And then Gilead, I expect a lot more people will have heard of this one because, for one thing, it's more recent, but also it gets a lot of love on BookTube. So this is about the Reverend John Ames, who's a Congregationalist minister. So he's also a Calvinist, like in The Blood of the Lamb, but he's a minister, right? So not a layman, but a minister. The book is basically an epistolary novel. So John Ames is in his 70s, and he knows at the outset of the novel that he is dying, or at least that he doesn't have long to live. And so he basically writes what we read in the novel as a long letter to his very young son. He has a son who's 7 years old, I believe. And so he knows that because he's going to die soon, his son will not have very strong memories of him because he will have died when he was so young. And so he writes this so that his son can kind of know him through it. And so again, deals with a lot of things, a big focus on religious ideas in it, but also, exploring themes of fatherhood, motherhood, Bibby being a husband and wife. John Ames' wife is a big character in this, and many other things. And it takes place in Iowa. So they also do kind of share a setting. They're both in the Midwest. This one much more rural Midwest. This one much more metropolitan Midwest, right? Because it takes place in Chicago. But so in terms of the similarities, why I think they would make a good pairing, they both have Calvinists as protagonists, right? That's a little bit superficial, but they do both have this sort of Calvinist perspective. In one case, a pastor. In the other case, a layman. And I actually think that would make them an interest, that adds to why they would be interesting to pair, because you've got a pastor's kind of perspective and then a layman's kind of perspective, right? Because a pastor will have a much more sophisticated, deep knowledge of faith than probably a layman would, right? And both do have religious faith as a theme, right? More in Gilead than in The Blood of the Lamb, but it is still a big part of The Blood of the Lamb. They both take place in the 1950s, of course. They both also, and I think this might be the strongest connection between them, deal with loss. In John Ames' case, his own death. In The Blood of the Lamb's case, not the protagonist's death, but the death of other loved ones. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil things, although I will say that if you go read the Goodreads description of The Blood of the Lamb, it will basically spoil a lot about it, which is really annoying. But in The Blood of the Lamb, the loss is of others, but both books deal very intensely with loss. And I think that's actually the best connection between them. And again, it's interesting to pair them because in Gilead you've got the protagonist himself dealing with his own mortality, and The Blood of the Lamb, the protagonist dealing with the death of certain of his loved ones. Right? And so, anyway, that's my last double feature. So, those are 3 double features. I kept it to fiction for this, just because I thought if I have a lot of ideas for a lot of double features. I have a note on my phone with a ton of them. And if I had included nonfiction with the fiction, then it would have just probably spiraled out of control. So I kept it to fiction, but I could see myself kind of doing other iterations of this kind of video with other bookish double features. Of fiction and nonfiction. Poetry could be cool to do as well. But I'd be curious to hear from you all what you think of my double features, whether you agree, what you think of the books, but also what bookish double features you might think of, right? Do you have any pairs of books that you think might be particularly interesting? So let me know. Let me know your thoughts and any bookish double features that you can think of that you think might be cool or that I should read. But otherwise, I will leave it at that, and I hope you all have a good day.